You know, the part of the reason, there's a couple reasons you use Flutter. One is it's pretty approachable, and it's approachable on a bunch of platforms. But the other is that you can deploy it to a bunch of platforms. So we're going to talk a little bit about how the default project structure doesn't actually align for what you may need to be if you are an enterprise customer. If you're a small shop, you're building your own app, then the default project structure works great. So there are actually 6 deployment targets, at least for Flutter. On the desktop side, there's Mac OS, Windows, and Linux. And on the application side, there's a web app, iOS, and Android. And so I'm going to ignore the desktop part because I don't really do any of that, and focus a little bit on the packaging side, on the application and embedded side. And why are there those two? So a lot of times the default project gives you an application. Hey, I can run this web app in Chrome or with Canvas Kit, and I can go debug that thing, right? And then the other one is the other two are obviously iOS and Android, and those out of the box come with the ability to build pretty much a standalone app that you can push off into the store with a little bit of work. And basically it's all Flutter all the time, except for some native code wrapped around it that hopefully you don't have to understand, right? But it turns out that iOS and Android, there's actually another way to do that. So we just talked about application. The other one is, what if I'm going to embed that in an existing application? So on the web side, you can take your web app and embed it in an existing application, either as an iframe or in an element replacement. But basically the packaging is identical. So you build a web app and then you either portal it into somewhere else or you make it a standalone app. And so that's not really interesting. I mean, it's interesting because it's cool and I develop in it as much as the phone, but but on the important part is, if you end up needing to deploy Flutter as like a conversation inside an Android or an iOS app, then you need a different packaging, the default. And it turns out the default structure actually is not your friend. Well, I mean, it's kind of your friend, but not really. So I'm going to show you here. If we ignore Mac, Windows, and Linux, we had 5 deployment models, right? We had the web model, which could be standalone or embedded in a website. And then we had iOS and Android standalone, and we have iOS and Android modules. And so it turns out, though, that the project structure supports Android and iOS, a single version in your project. You can do more, but it gets funky. I mean, I just don't think it works right. So out of the box, what they do is they generate a web project, an iOS project, an Android project, and the Android and the iOS project let you run it in the emulator or simulator immediately. They basically provide a minimal native shell that you can do some stuff, and everything in there can get checked in that isn't ephemeral. So there are big pieces of that can be checked in, and just like the web. And that's why those basically can build from top to bottom because they include the entire structure. On the other hand, if you're going to build a module, you're going to embed your application in a native app, then you end up probably with a .android or a .ios directory. And I have had some trouble having an Android and a .android. It gets confused. So generally, and also the packaging is different anyway, so it's not clear you want to do it that way. So a project can be in a module or an app, but generally not both in the same project. But a lot of times what I'm going to want is I'm going to build an app, I'm going to integrate something into a bigger app, but I also want a lightweight test jig because my big app's really heavy to play with. And if I could just play with the Flutter pieces standalone, then I might want a test jig for that. So what does that look like? And yeah, I saw this before in a bunch of places and I couldn't figure out why they thought that. But basically the idea is you take your reusable Flutter code, it goes into a package. So if you look at the part at the bottom, I don't know why I guess I ran out of places to put the little, balloon thing. But the bottom is basically where all the Flutter code's in a package. And then we pull that Flutter code just like any third-party package, but we can do it relative addressing here, so we don't have to push it somewhere like pub-get or Artifactory. And then I would end up with an apps area, which would be standalone apps, and a modules area for pieces, where all of the build config would be for generating modules that would be included in some native app. So in my case, I'll create an apps area, and in the app, Flutter application, because it's all the same app, I would have an Android and iOS in a web folder, and that lets me run those standalone. And maybe I never release the iOS and Android standalone, or maybe that is my target. And the web, like I said, we can use to embed and also to have a standalone app. And then the modules, though, are buildable items. They end up with a .iOS or a .android directory that don't get checked in. And they basically just define the module structure that you're going to have. And you go build an AAR or you build a framework module, and then you include those, right? And actually, if you look at the standalone apps, that's really what they do, right? They have a small shell, and that shell pulls the code in immediately. But in this case, we're actually going to do it as a module because a lot of times if you're working with an enterprise app, you end up needing to push that somewhere. And so we're actually going to build those as modules and push them somewhere, and then the other team can pull them in. So this is the structure, right? I have the reusable code. 90-something% of my Flutter code goes into the packages. And then I have my apps, which typically would have been in the same project in the default. And then I have my modules, which are the AAR and the framework packaging. And that's the way that works. And that gives me different life cycles, and it also makes it easy for me to figure out what I want to do in the build pipeline, right? Today I'm going to build packages and standalone apps, and we only build the AAR or the framework package when we need to go integrate. It just depends on what you want to do, but I never could figure out why people did this structure, and now I know, and hopefully you do too.